Alright, strap in everyone because we're about to wade into a topic that's about as fun as a barrel full of scorpions wearing tiny little hats made of anxiety. We're talking, of course, about nuclear war. Now, I know what you're thinking. John, I just finished watching a video of a pug dressed as a pirate riding a Roomba. I'm not emotionally prepared for the potential downfall of civilization. And you know what? You're right. But here's the thing. Sometimes, the things that keep us up at night are the things we need to talk about the most. So, let's imagine, just for a moment, a world where the unthinkable happens. A full-blown nuclear exchange between Russia and NATO. Spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for anyone involved, but let's unpack this ticking time bomb of a scenario, shall we? Let's be clear, we're not talking about a surgical strike here, a little oops, my bad explosion. We're talking full-blown thermonuclear warheads raining down on major cities. Picture it, New York, Moscow, London, gone. Vaporized in an instant. Millions of lives extinguished before you could even say mutually assured destruction. And for those not lucky enough to be at ground zero? Well, get ready for firestorms so intense they make the Great Chicago Fire look like a bonfire, and enough thermal radiation to give you a really bad sunburn. We're talking third-degree burns from miles away, folks. And that's just the tip of this radioactive iceberg. Remember those casualty estimates I mentioned earlier? They vary wildly depending on who you ask, but even the most optimistic ones are talking tens of millions dead within the first few hours. But hey, let's say you're one of the lucky ones. You're tucked away in your nuclear bunker riding out the apocalypse in style. So you've survived the initial blast, dodged the firestorms, and even managed to avoid acute radiation poisoning. You've earned yourself a celebratory can of irradiated peaches. But don't get too comfortable because things are about to get chilly. Remember all those fires I mentioned earlier? Turns out setting entire cities ablaze releases a teensy-weensy side effect soot. And by teensy-weensy I mean enough to block out the sun and plunge the planet into a perpetual twilight. Welcome to nuclear winter, everyone. Hope you brought a sweater. Now, you might be thinking, John, I live in Minnesota. We haven't seen the sun since 1987 anyway. And to you I say fair point. But this is different. We're talking about a global temperature drop that would make the ice age look like a heat wave. Crops will fail. Animals will die. And that global food supply chain we all rely on, let's just say it's going to be about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Okay, so you've somehow managed to survive the blast, the radiation, and the famine. You've even fashioned yourself a rather fetching hat out of a rusty tin can and some barbed wire. You, my friend, are a survivor. But don't start celebrating just yet because the bad news just keeps on coming. You see, while you were busy perfecting your post-apocalyptic sourdough recipe, the entire global economy decided to take an unscheduled and rather permanent vacation. Turns out, when your major trade centers are smoldering craters and your financial hubs look like something out of a Godzilla movie, international commerce tends to grind to a screeching halt. And for those countries that weren't directly involved in the nuclear slugfest, well, they get to play a fun little game called Pick Your Poison. Do you accept the refugees fleeing the irradiated wastelands knowing that resources are already stretched thin? Or do you close your borders and risk becoming a target yourself? It's a no-win situation, really. So far, we've established that nuclear war is about as much fun as a sandpaper face mask. But just in case you were still holding out hope, allow me to deliver the final blow. The environment, that thing that keeps us all alive and breathing, is going to be about as hospitable as a Venus sauna after a particularly pungent bowl of space chili. Remember that radiation we talked about earlier? The one that hangs around like a bad smell at a cheese factory? Well, it's not just bad for humans, it's bad for everything. Plants, animals, ecosystems, you name it, radiation will ruin it. We're talking contaminated water supplies, poisoned soil, and entire species getting wiped off the map faster than you can say evolutionary dead end. And for those of you who find solace in the ocean thinking, "Ha! The fish will be fine." Well, I hate to break it to you, but the ocean isn't some magical radioactive-proof bubble. It's an ecosystem interconnected with everything else on this planet. Now I know what you're thinking. John, this is all very bleak, you're bumming me out. And to you, I say, mission accomplished. The point of this exercise wasn't to give you a reason to invest in an underground bunker and a lifetime supply of canned goods. It was to highlight the terrifying reality of nuclear war. Because here's the thing, it's not just the countries that get directly nuked that suffer. It's everyone. Remember those global ripple effects we talked about? They're not just economic or environmental, they're political, social, and humanitarian. Imagine a world where alliances are redrawn based on who has the least amount of radioactive isotopes in their soil, where wars erupt over dwindling resources and habitable land. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The potential consequences of a nuclear war are about as appealing as a plate of lukewarm mayonnaise sandwiches. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to be this way. Despite what some Bond villains might believe, blowing each other up is not the only option on the table. Diplomacy, arms control, and a healthy dose of common sense are far more effective and infinitely less catastrophic ways to resolve conflict. The reality is, both NATO and Russia have more than enough nuclear firepower to turn our planet into a radioactive wasteland. It's the whole mutually assured destruction principle. The problem is, assured destruction doesn't leave much room for, not being destroyed.